The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song at 2,300 hours when Katie Rodriguez clocked in for another night shift at Sacred Heart. 6 months. 184 days of making herself smaller, quieter, less present in a place where presence was the only currency that mattered. She hung her jacket in her locker, the same one she'd used since orientation, and pulled her scrubs tight, tucking the broken chain and its single dog tag beneath the neckline. The weight of it pressed against her sternum like an anchor. Like a reminder. Stay invisible. Stay quiet. Survive. The Jacksonville humidity clung to her as she moved through the automatic doors into the cardiac wing, where the antiseptic smell hit like a wall, that sharp chemical bite that reminded her too much of forward operating bases and triage tents and the smell of blood underneath the bleach. She'd learned to breathe through it. 6 months of breathing through it. Her limp was barely perceptible now, the legacy of shrapnel in her left knee from a detonation that had taken 3 of her soldiers and left her with a medical discharge and a pension she couldn't spend because spending it meant admitting the old life was over. Katie didn't meet eyes during shift change. That was rule 1. She stood at the edge of the medication cart while the day nurses handed off their patients, their voices washing over her in a familiar current of jargon and complaint. Someone mentioned a difficult family member. Someone else was talking about weekend plans. She heard none of it. Her attention was elsewhere, on the vital signs boards, on the cardiac monitor tracings, on the weigh room for 08 showed an irregular rhythm that hadn't been there 3 hours ago. She made a mental note. Assessment. Observation. The kind of tactical situational awareness that had kept her and her squad alive in the Sanjin Valley didn't disappear just because she'd traded in 416 Hong Kong dollars for a stethoscope. Dr. Ashford arrived at 23:10, his pressed white coat moving through the ER like a sail catching wind. He was tall in the way that mattered, not just physically, but in the way he occupied space, the way everyone shifted slightly to accommodate his trajectory. His jawline could have cut glass, sharp and calculated, and his eyes moved across the room with the assessment of someone used to finding things lacking. He'd built his career on rigid hierarchies and board connections, on knowing exactly which palms to grease and which voices to listen to. The probationary nurses, he didn't listen to those. They were replaceable. Forgettable. Invisible unless they became problems. Katie felt his gaze pass over her without stopping. That was good. That was the entire point. She moved with practiced quietness, her steps careful and deliberate, her voice when she did speak barely above a whisper. The other nurses sometimes tried to include her in conversations. She deflected with single-word responses and downcast eyes. Most of them had stopped trying. She preferred it that way. Attention was dangerous. Attention was scrutiny. Attention was the opposite of invisible. She was reviewing the intake chart for a patient in room for 06, 67-year-old male, admitted 6 hours ago with fever and hypertension, elevated lactate levels that screamed sepsis, when the nurse's station radio crackled with a new admission. Trauma incoming from a car accident on I-95. Katie's hands moved before her brain caught up, pulling a bed into position, checking the overhead lights, verifying the crash cart was stocked. Her hands moved like someone who'd done this thousands of times in places where hesitation killed people. That muscle memory didn't fade. It lived in her bones. She was restocking the 4 kit when Dr. Ashford walked past room 406, glancing at the chart that hung at the foot of the bed. He was moving quickly, distracted, his phone vibrating in his coat pocket. But Katie watched the way his expression shifted, a subtle hardening, a decision made without examination. She'd seen that look before. It was the look of someone concluding something wasn't worth his time. He pulled the chart from its slot and began writing discharge orders. His signature was fluid, confident, final. Katie felt the dog tag press against her chest. The weight of it. The meaning of it. The husband who'd gone into Helmand Province 8 years ago and never come back. The promise she'd made in a hospital cafeteria while his casket was being loaded onto a transport plane. Stay safe. Start over. Build something quiet. She approached room 406 on the pretense of checking the blood pressure cuff, already cuffing the patient's arm, watching the numbers climb, 148/92. Elevated. Wrong. The patient's eyes were glassy, his skin flushed, not fever flush, but the flush of infection overwhelming a system. The labs would back her up. She knew they would. She'd learned to read the subtle mathematics of a body in crisis the way other people read maps. When she came to the nurse's station, Dr. Ashford was signing the final discharge order with the certainty of someone who didn't expect to be questioned. Katie stood 3 feet from him, her voice barely carrying across the space between them. Dr. Ashford. Room 406 lactate was 4.2 at intake. Current temperature is 103.8. Blood pressure's climbing. She paused, choosing her words with the same care she'd use selecting a surgical approach. Vital signs suggest infection progression. Sepsis protocol might warrant rechecking labs before discharge. The pen stopped moving. It hung suspended above the signature line like a blade mid-swing. Dr. Ashford's head turned toward her with the slow deliberation of someone unaccustomed to contradiction. His eyes were the color of a glacier in winter, cold, hard, and capable of grinding things to nothing if given enough time. He looked at her the way a surgeon might look at a nurse who'd questioned his choice of instruments. He looked at her the way someone looks at a problem that's about to become worse. "I'll handle the medical decisions, Rodriguez." His voice was measured, precise, each word placed like a chess piece. "Your job is to distribute ice chips and empty bedpans. Do you understand?" Katie felt the moment crystallize. This was the second time he'd spoken her name. The first time had been during orientation, when he'd rattled off probationary protocol while barely glancing at her. This time felt different. This time felt like a notation being entered into a file. She moved her hand slightly, and her fingers brushed the fabric of her scrubs where the dog tag lay hidden. Just a touch. Just enough to feel it. Just enough to remind herself why she was here. Why she was small. Why she was quiet. "Yes, doctor." The words came out barely audible, a whisper that matched her downcast eyes perfectly. She turned away from the station before he could see anything else, before her composure could slip into something that didn't fit this version of herself. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she knew, with the absolute certainty that comes from 8 years of making life or death calls in actual combat zones, that Dr. Ashford was making a mistake. That the discharge order for room 406 would be followed by a readmission 48 hours later, probably around 0300 when his septic shock would be profound enough to require blood products and a critical care bed. That if she were the kind of person who still spoke up, who still believed her voice mattered, she could prevent that. She could save that man another 2 days of deterioration, another $1,000 of hospital bills, possibly his life. But that person was gone. That person had died when the IED detonated in Helmand Province. That person had stayed there with Marcus and the 7 others in the convoy. This version of Katie Rodriguez, the one in the probationary scrubs with the hidden dog tag and the barely audible whisper, this version played by the rules. This version survived. She moved through the rest of the shift like a ghost, her hand steady as a surgical laser despite the tremor of restraint running through her. The incoming trauma arrived at 2347 with sirens and organized chaos, and she helped position the patient without being asked, her movements efficient and precise but not prominent. She didn't catch Dr. Ashford's eye again. She didn't need to. The decision was made. The threshold had been crossed. By the time the sun came up over Jacksonville, Katie knew something had shifted. Some small wall had been breached. She'd spoken up. She'd been shut down. And both of them now understood exactly how the hierarchy worked. She was a probationary nurse with a broken chain around her neck and a husband buried in rain-soaked earth. He was Dr. Ashford, the man who'd built his career on people knowing their place. She just didn't know yet how far he would go to remind her of hers. Dr. Ashford picked up the phone at the nurse's station and pressed the overhead page button. His voice echoed through every floor of Sacred Heart, smooth and theatrical, designed to carry, designed to wound. "Would Roddy the robot please report to the ER desk immediately?" Apparently our probationary nurse thinks she knows better than physicians. The page ended with a soft click. Silence followed. Then the laughter started. 30 heads turned toward Katie as she stood at the medication dispensary in the cardiac wing. The laughter rippled through the corridor like a wave, starting soft, building, becoming almost physical. A resident near the trauma bay elbowed his colleague. 2 nurses by the supply cart exchanged glances that said everything without words. Katie felt the weight of 30 pairs of eyes as she set down the medication tray with measured precision, her hand steady despite the heat crawling up her neck. She took one measured breath. The walk from the medication station to the ER desk was 47 steps. She counted them. Muscle memory from a different life, a life where you counted distance, angles, escape routes. A single tear slid down her left cheek as she walked. She didn't stop it. She didn't hide it. She wiped it with her thumb without breaking eye contact with the overhead speaker, her jaw tight but her spine absolutely straight. The tear was control, not weakness. The composure of someone who had already survived worse than a man's mockery. Dr. Ashford stood at the desk with 3 residents flanking him, arranged like subordinates around a throne. He smiled when he saw her approach, the smile of a man who believed he'd just won something. Rodriguez. Thank you for joining us. He didn't move away from the desk. His voice remained conversational, designed for the audience of staff members now openly watching from across the ER. I wanted to remind you that you're 3 months into a 6-month probation. These are critical months. Months where judgment matters. Where protocol matters. He paused, letting the words settle. Do you understand what I'm saying? Katie said nothing. She'd learned that silence was sometimes the sharpest tool. I asked you a question. His voice hardened just enough to suggest consequences. Probationary nurses who question attending physicians don't last at Sacred Heart. I have friends on the hospital board who trust my judgment about who belongs in clinical care and who belongs elsewhere. People who would very much like to see this probation result in the right outcome for all of us. He smiled again. Do we understand each other? The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a heart monitor beeped in steady rhythm. Katie's hand instinctively moved to the dog tag beneath her scrubs, the one on the broken chain, the one that belonged to someone who would never come home from Helmand Province. She touched it once through the fabric of her shirt, a gesture invisible to everyone watching. Respect isn't demanded, Dr. Ashford. Her voice was quiet. Perfect pitch. It's earned. She didn't wait for his response. She turned and walked away with her spine straight, her limp barely noticeable, moving like someone who had already decided what mattered and what didn't. Ashford's expression flickered, surprise, then something darker. Anger that she hadn't broken. Frustration that she hadn't given him the satisfaction of tears or apologies or visible damage. He'd expected trembling. He'd expected her to retreat into herself the way she had during the sepsis patient incident. Instead, she'd delivered 4 words that hung in the ER like a challenge, and she'd walked away before he could respond. The following week, Ashford executed his next move. It happened during shift change, 1900 hours, when the incoming night staff was gathering in the parking lot for briefing, the moment when maximum visibility was guaranteed. Katie was restocking a supply cart near the loading zone when Dr. Ashford's voice cut across the asphalt. Rodriguez. You're on orderly duties effective immediately. Restocking, transport, no patient contact. You lack the judgment for clinical decision-making, and I won't have that liability in my emergency department. 40 pairs of eyes turned toward her. The parking lot went absolutely silent. The kind of silence where you could hear the wind moving through the palm trees, where you could hear the distant traffic on San Marco Avenue. A resident next to Ashford exchanged a glance with another physician, the kind of look that said don't be that person next. Katie's hand moved to the dog tag beneath her scrubs. She touched it once, twice, the familiar metal pressing against her palm through the thin fabric. The tag was a reminder of who she had been. Who she still was, beneath 6 months of invisibility. beneath the probation and the humiliation and the deliberate erasure. It was a talisman. It was an anchor. It was the only piece of her old life she had kept, and in that moment, standing in the parking lot at sunset with 40 witnesses watching to see if she would break, she let that reality settle into her chest like bone. She nodded once. Understood, Dr. Ashford. Her voice was steady. Flat. Professional. The voice of someone accepting an assignment, not accepting judgment. She didn't apologize. She didn't defend herself. She didn't explain. She simply nodded, turned, and continued restocking the supply cart, moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who knew exactly what she was capable of and had decided that this man's opinion of her capabilities was irrelevant. Ashford had expected anger. He had expected her to fight back, to protest, to give him grounds for further action. He had not expected acceptance. He had not expected her to absorb the demotion like water, without resistance, without visible damage. He had expected her to flinch. Instead, she'd simply acknowledged his authority and returned to her work, and somehow that was worse because it suggested she didn't believe his authority was real, that his judgment of her was something to accept the way you accept weather. The parking lot returned to normal. Staff members dispersed to their units. The night shift began. And Katie Rodriguez spent the next 12 hours restocking linens and transporting equipment, her limp pronounced in the empty corridors of the night shift, her mind quiet and focused and remembering things about herself that she'd spent 6 months trying to forget. By 2300 hours, she was in the linen closet on the 4th floor, restocking supplies in the darkness, when she heard the first alarm bells in her mind, not from the hospital, but from some deeper place. The place that had kept her and her team alive in Kandahar province. The place that recognized patterns before they became visible. The place that was never quite asleep, no matter how quiet she made herself. She finished her work and moved through the corridors of Sacred Heart like a ghost, checking rooms, checking vital signs on monitors through open doors, doing work she wasn't assigned to do. The midnight shift passed. The early morning hours arrived. She was restocking linens on the 4th floor when the alarm came, not metaphorical, not internal, but real. At 0200 hours, the fire alarm shrieked. Smoke was already billowing from the cardiac wing's west corridor, thick and black and moving with purpose. Katie moved on pure instinct. 6 months of deliberate invisibility evaporated in a single moment. Her combat medic training took over. The muscle memory that had kept her alive through 8 years of combat overrode the probation, the demotion, the humiliation. She ran toward the flames while evacuation protocols sent everyone else toward the stairwells, her body moving with the kind of certainty that only came from having already faced the worst. Room 403, an elderly woman disconnected from her monitor, confused and coughing. Katie scooped her into a modified carry and moved through the smoke with her eyes slitted against the heat. The woman's body was light, maybe 110 pounds, and Katie's limp barely registered as she navigated the debris-filled hallway. She deposited the patient with a firefighter at the stairwell and moved back into the smoke without hesitation. Room 405, a teenager from a motor vehicle accident, still on morphine, disoriented and terrified. Katie talked to him, calm, direct, authoritative, and guided him to the stairwell with her hand on his back. Room 406, a man in his 50s with a jammed door. Katie kicked through it with her right leg, the one that was supposed to limp, and it gave way with a crash of splintered wood. She extracted him. Room 408, this was where everything changed. The distinguished-looking man in his 60s had gone into respiratory arrest from smoke inhalation. His chart read J. Morrison, admitted for routine cardiac monitoring, but there was something about his bearing even in unconsciousness, something that suggested importance, authority, weight. His oxygen saturation was 54. Dropping. His lips were already starting to cyanose. Katie positioned him on his back, tilted his head to open the airway, cleared his mouth. No obstruction. She pinched his nose and began rescue breathing, mouth to mouth, her hands remembering protocols from Helm and Province even as her mind stayed locked on Sacred Heart. Oxygen. 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 The mantra was simple. The execution was everything. His pulse returned after the fourth breath. Weak at first, then stronger. His eyes flickered. His chest began moving on its own. Katie heard footsteps behind her and didn't turn. Firefighters in full gear entered the room. She gave them the status: respiratory arrest, now resuscitated, sinus rhythm restored, oxygen saturation climbing, and stepped back, her voice clinical and precise. By the time the sun rose over Jacksonville at 0630 hours, 11 patients had been evacuated from the cardiac wing. 11 people who would go home to families because a probationary nurse with a broken limb and a hidden past had run toward the flames instead of away from them. Dr. Ashford stood in the parking lot at dawn with the fire chief, his mind already working the angles, seeing opportunity in crisis the way predators see opportunity in blood in water. The fire was contained. The patients were safe. The headlines would be glowing. Sacred Heart had heroes. And he was already planning how to take credit. But that wasn't the worst part. Not yet. 2:02 in the morning. Fire alarm shrieked through Sacred Heart's cardiac wing like a scream nobody could ignore. Smoke billowed from the west corridor in thick, rolling clouds that moved like something alive, consuming the darkness and turning hallway lights into ghostly amber halos. The hospital had practiced this 100 times. Drills. Protocols. Orderly evacuation routes diagrammed on every wall. Nobody who worked here had ever seen the real thing. Katie Rodriguez was restocking linens on the 4th floor when the alarm cut through the fluorescent hum. She stood holding a stack of fresh pillowcases against her chest, her hand steady, her breathing unchanged. Around her, staff moved in practiced formation, nurses guiding ambulatory patients toward the stairwell, orderlies checking rooms, voices clipping out commands with the tone of people who had trained for this exact moment but never believed it would happen. She set the linens down on the nearest shelf. And then she moved toward the smoke. The stairwell was packed. Bodies pressing downward in controlled chaos, fire safety training overriding panic. Katie slipped past the flow like a swimmer moving upstream, her small frame easy to miss, nobody stopping her because her face carried the certainty of someone who knew exactly where she needed to be. Muscle memory isn't just what your hands remember. It's what your legs remember. It's the way your lungs open when the alarm goes off because they've learned, over 3 tours and 2 Purple Hearts, that this is where you run toward. Room for 04. Sedated cardiac patient. 78-year-old man who'd been post-op for 4 days and whose monitor showed a rhythm that wasn't going to survive smoke inhalation without intervention. The smoke was thicker on the 3rd floor, visibility down to maybe 10 feet. Katie moved through it like water, her hand along the railing, counting steps. For steps. Patient rooms. 204. 206. 208. The muscle memory was older than her name. Inside room for 04, the sedated patient was still in bed, unaware. His oxygen was running at 3 liters through nasal cannula. Katie grabbed a handheld bag valve mask from the wall, attached the 100% oxygen port in one smooth motion, and stripped the nasal cannula away. She positioned herself between the patient and the smoke, her body shielding his airway, and began squeezing the bag with the rhythm of someone who had done this in convoy ambushes and forward operating bases. 60 compressions a minute. Steady. Deliberate. The sound of the bag re-expanding, that soft plastic gasp, was the only thing she was listening to now. She half-dragged, half-carried him toward the corridor. He weighed maybe 180, dead weight, his legs not responding. Katie moved him like someone who had loaded casualties onto stretchers in the dark, arms under his armpits, her legs bending from the knees, his head lolling back. The smoke was getting thicker. She counted the steps anyway. Left toward the stairwell. 12 steps. 15. 20. The heat was rising from the floors below, making the smoke layer heavier at her chest level, clearer near the ceiling. She kept him low, his mouth near her face, keeping pressure on the bag, moving through the grey-white murk like a woman operating on a map only she could read. By the time she got him to the paramedics at the ER entrance, his oxygen saturation was holding at 92%. His skin was cool. His pupils reactive. She didn't stop. She didn't explain. She just handed him to the waiting hands and turned back toward the smoke that was still pouring from the stairwell. Room for 08 was on the second floor now. She was moving through smoke so thick she couldn't see her own feet. The heat was a presence, something that pressed against her skin like an open hand. Her badge was getting hot. The lanyard burned. She pulled it off and dropped it, her eyes watering but her breathing controlled, the way you breathe when adrenaline is screaming and your training is the only thing still in charge. Room for 08. Distinguished-looking man, maybe late 60s, in a tailored shirt instead of a gown. Someone important, the kind of posture that came from a lifetime of being recognized. He was slumped in the chair beside his bed, his chest heaving, his mouth open, working for air that wasn't there anymore. Respiratory arrest. Smoke inhalation. His oxygen had run out and his lungs had stopped responding. Katie moved the chair aside, grabbed the BVM again, and positioned his head with her hand under his neck. She opened his airway and began ventilating him with the kind of precision that looked gentle but wasn't. Each squeeze was forceful, each release steady. His oxygen saturation climbed. 84. 88. 90. He gasped. His eyes opened. "Can you walk?" Her voice was flat. Instructional. He nodded, confused, and she got him to his feet with her arm under his shoulder. They moved toward the stairwell together, but the smoke was too thick now, visibility gone completely. The fire was climbing. She could hear it, a sound like applause, like wind in the dark, like something feeding. The second-floor stairwell was blocked. Heat radiating from below. Katie changed direction without hesitation. Fourth floor. That corridor connected through the administrator's wing. Different stairwell. Longer route, but passable. The man beside her was coughing, his lungs burning, and Katie was counting steps again, down the corridor, through the administrative wing, past the empty reception desk where someone's coffee sat cooling in the dark. His arm around her shoulders. Her arm around his waist. Moving like a pair of dancers who had never rehearsed but somehow knew the steps anyway. But that wasn't the worst part of the night. The worst part was waiting in the triage area on the ground floor, waiting for the next patient, and the next, and the next. Katie's uniform was singed. Her hands were blistered where the oxygen line had burned against her skin. Her hair smelled like smoke and her lungs felt raw, but she was already moving toward the ER physician who was gesturing her toward the waiting area where another patient needed evacuation. She counted 7 more. Some walking. Some dragged. Some carried because their legs had forgotten how. An elderly man named George whose surgical wounds had opened during the chaos, blood soaking through his gown, his chest exposed to the smoke and heat. Katie recognized him from the recovery wing. Post-op unstable. The triage area was set up in the main lobby, folding tables and emergency supplies scattered across the tile floor. George was on one of those tables, his breathing shallow, a sucking sound coming from his chest as it drew air through the open wound. Pneumothorax. Tension pneumothorax if she didn't seal it. Katie found her lunch bag sitting on a bench where she'd left it at the start of shift, MRE from her locker, always kept, always there from the old days when field medicine meant working with what you had. She opened the flameless ration heater pouch inside and found the beef stew MRE. She tore open the wrapper, peeled away the plastic backing, and pressed it against George's chest, wound with the kind of pressure that meant business. The plastic seal worked exactly the way it had worked in Helmand Province. It kept the air inside, let the lung expand, created a barrier between the wound and the open air. George's breathing eased. His shoulders relaxed. His oxygen saturation began climbing, 86, 89, 92. "It's keeping him alive until we get him to surgery," Katie said when Dr. Ashford appeared beside her, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the MRE wrapper pressed against the old man's chest. Ashford's jaw tightened. "That's not hospital protocol, Rodriguez." She didn't look at him. She kept her hand steady on the seal, feeling George's chest rise and fall, her fingers monitoring the pressure, the seal, the stability. It's the difference between his lung collapsing and staying inflated. Pick your protocol. The look he gave her then, it wasn't anger. It was calculation. The kind of look a man gives someone when he's just decided they're useful for destroying something. He turned away, pulling his phone from his pocket, and Katie heard him speaking into it before he'd even stepped 10 feet distant. Words like liability and protocol violation and endangering patients floating across the lobby like smoke. By the time the sun rose over Jacksonville, the fire was contained. The cardiac wing was damaged but salvageable. The sprinkler systems had done their job. Paramedics were loading the last of the rescued patients into ambulances, sirens wailing in the early morning quiet like a lament nobody had asked for. Katie had pulled 11 people from that building. 11. She was sitting on a bench in the parking lot, her uniform covered in soot and blood that wasn't hers, her hands wrapped in gauze, when a nurse she didn't recognize approached her with a look of something like pity. "HR wants to see you," the nurse said quietly. "Security's going to walk you inside." Katie nodded. She didn't ask questions. She already knew how this was going to go. She'd seen men like Ashford move before, seen the way they turned survival into ammunition, the way they took the thing that saved people and weaponized it into something that looked like misconduct if you squinted hard enough and had friends on the board who owed you favors. She stood, still holding her burned badge lanyard in her left hand, and walked toward the hospital entrance where 2 uniformed security officers were waiting to escort her to the administrative offices on the 5th floor. What happened in that HR office would matter less than what Ashford was already doing on his phone, the calls to his attorney, to the chief nursing officer, to the board members whose names were in his contact list like a catalogue of institutional power. He had already filed the incident report. He had already built the narrative. By the time Katie sat down across from the HR director, her career at Sacred Heart was already being dismantled by someone who understood that the best way to destroy a threat was to make the thing that saved her look like recklessness in a room full of people who'd never had to improvise with an MRE wrapper to keep someone alive. 2 days after the fire, the dismissal letter sat in Katie's locker like a bomb with a countdown timer she couldn't see. Sacred Heart Hospital letterhead. Official seal. 3 paragraphs of institutional language that translated to a single sentence, "You're done here." Reckless disregard for hospital policy and patient safety during emergency evacuation, the letter read. The words were precise, lawyered, untouchable. Not a lie. A weaponization of truth. Dr. Ashford had filed his incident report within 6 hours of the fire being extinguished, claiming Katie had violated evacuation protocols by running toward the flames instead of out of the building. He'd called it patient endangerment. He'd called it recklessness. He'd called it the perfect reason to terminate a probationary nurse whose only mistake was saving lives in a way that made him look small. She'd learned what happened next from a resident who'd felt guilty enough to tell her. Ashford had spent the 2 days between the fire and her termination making phone calls to people who mattered, board members with money, hospital administrators with authority, people who understood that narrative was more powerful than facts. He'd restricted her access to patient floors that morning. Security had been instructed to escort her out if she tried to work. He'd built his case methodically, competently, with the precision of a man who understood that institutions protect their own first and ask questions later. Katie read the letter 3 times, each word sinking deeper. The signature line was initialed by HR, but everyone in the hospital knew whose hand had written this. Ashford had taken her heroism and reframed it as protocol violation, and he'd done it in a way that would hold up to scrutiny because technically, by the strict reading of hospital evacuation procedures, he was right. She'd been told to leave the building. She'd stayed instead. The fact that 11 people were alive because of that choice didn't matter in a room full of lawyers and board members who'd never had to make a decision that mattered. Her hands were steady as she pulled her personal items from the locker, a photo of Miguel from his high school graduation, a backup pair of scrubs, the water bottle she'd carried for 6 months without anyone knowing the last time she'd held something this ordinary had been 8 years ago. The dog tag hung against her chest, hidden beneath her shirt like a secret. Marcus's dog tag. The one reminder that the person she'd tried so hard to erase had been real, that the life before this one had existed, that she hadn't imagined the desert or the blood or the weight of keeping people alive with nothing but training and improvisation. The rain started as she drove toward Riverside Memorial Cemetery, the kind of rain that sounds like gunfire on a windshield, that makes the world feel like it's washing away. She didn't try to stop herself from going there. Protocol, procedure, the things that were supposed to keep you functional in crisis, they didn't apply to this. This was the moment after, when the adrenaline wore off and you understood what you'd actually lost. Marcus Rodriguez's grave was quiet, the granite headstone dark with rain. She collapsed to her knees on grass that was cold and soaked, her scrubs immediately heavy with water, her breath coming in gasps she hadn't planned on taking. The cemetery was empty. Just her and the man who'd asked her to walk away from his world, who'd made her promise to build something civilian and normal and safe, who died in Helmand Province 8 years ago so that Katie could try to become someone who didn't wake up at 3 a.m. reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. "I tried to start over like you wanted, Marcus," she whispered. Her voice broke on the second syllable. "I kept my head down. 6 months without mentioning Kandahar or the extractions or any of it. I put the medals away. I wore the scrubs and took the insults and I didn't fight back because that's what you asked me to do. I failed." The rain mixed with tears on her face, and she didn't wipe them away. There was no one watching. No one to maintain composure for. Just a woman kneeling at a grave in Jacksonville, Florida, in the rain, telling her dead husband that she'd tried to be what he wanted and it hadn't been enough. The dog tag felt heavy against her chest, the metal warm from her skin, the only part of Marcus that had survived his deployment and hers. She'd kept it hidden because showing it would mean explaining, and explaining would mean her new life collapsing into her old one, and she couldn't afford that. Or so she'd thought. She stayed at the cemetery for an hour, maybe more. Time moved differently in those moments, the way it had in Helm and when she'd been working on a patient's femoral artery with shrapnel still falling around them. When the rain intensified, she finally stood, her knees shaking, and drove back to Sacred Heart Hospital in a daze that felt like shock, which meant she knew what was happening but couldn't quite process that it was real. The parking lot was busy with second shift arriving. She moved through them like a ghost, invisible again in the way she'd worked so hard to be invisible. The locker room was empty when she pushed open the door. She'd expected to feel something, anger, desperation, the kind of rage that a career ending should trigger. Instead she felt mechanical. Her hands moved through the motions. She pulled her personal items into a duffel bag without looking at them. She changed out of her scrubs into civilian clothes that felt like a costume she'd almost forgotten how to wear. The hallway was quiet as she made her way toward the exit, the one that led to the parking lot where her car was waiting to take her to whatever came next, apartment clearance, another job hunt at some other hospital where the same story might play out differently, another chance at being someone who wasn't a soldier masquerading as a nurse. She was so focused on the exit that she almost didn't see the figure in the hallway until he was already moving toward her. Miguel. Her son. 16 years old, rain-soaked and breathless, clutching something wrapped in his jacket like it was worth dying for. His eyes were red. His voice was cracking as he spoke the words she'd been dreading since the moment she'd decided to hide her past. "Mom, they need to see these," Miguel said, holding out what she immediately recognized as the shadow box. The one with Marcus's medals. The one she'd packed away 8 years ago because looking at them meant remembering, and remembering meant breaking the single rule her husband had made her promise to keep. "You can't let them do this to you." "Miguel, no." Her voice came out harder than she'd intended, but she was already moving toward him, already reaching, already understanding that her son had made a decision that would end her careful invisibility in the next 60 seconds. "Put that away. Right now." But he was already moving, his teenage legs faster than hers, already running toward the main entrance where he knew the morning staff would be gathered, where security would be standing, where Dr. Ashford would be watching the door to make sure she left without making a scene. She followed him anyway, her heart hammering, knowing exactly what would happen when that box opened in the lobby where 30 people could see it, where the implications would spread through Sacred Heart like a contagion that no amount of damage control could contain. The main entrance door swung open ahead of Miguel. Rain hammered against the glass on the other side, turning the Jacksonville morning into a watercolor of gray and silver. He burst through into the lobby like a missile, and Katie followed close enough to see the moment he stopped, the moment he opened the shadow box with trembling hands, the moment the world stopped moving at its normal speed. Miguel burst through the lobby doors like a missile, rain streaming from his jacket, his 16-year-old frame moving with the kind of desperate purpose that made heads turn. The shadow box was already open in his hands, and Katie saw it the same moment Dr. Ashford did, the same moment the security detail that had been restricting her access shifted their stance, no longer sure who they were supposed to be watching. Miguel's voice cracked as he held it toward his mother, toward the crowd that was beginning to gather around the information desk. "Mom, they need to see these. You can't let them do this to you." The rain had soaked through his clothes, dripping onto the polished tile, but his hands were steady as he opened the box wider. The lobby fell silent. Not the quiet of an empty room, but the silence that comes when the air itself stops moving. A trembling nurse, Rodriguez from pediatrics, who'd worked the night shift during the fire, stepped forward without thinking. She reached for the shadow box with the kind of reverence people usually reserved for religious artifacts. Her voice shook as she read aloud. "Bronze Star with Valor." She paused. Everyone in the lobby heard the intake of breath, the collective moment when the weight of those words settled. "Purple Heart." Dr. Ashford opened his mouth. Closed it. His hand moved toward the security officer nearest him, but the officer's attention had shifted, away from Katie, toward the group that had just arrived through the emergency entrance. 6 figures in navy dress uniforms, pressed and pristine, water droplets rolling off their shoulders like they'd walked through the rain without it daring to cling to them. One of them stepped forward, and the morning light caught the gold insignia on his collar. He moved with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. His eyes found Katie's, and he spoke quietly, just loud enough for the lobby to hear. "Major Rodriguez." It wasn't a question. It was a command dressed in a name she hadn't heard anyone speak aloud in 6 months. The Navy officer, the man from room 408, the cardiac patient she'd pulled from the smoke, was no longer in a hospital gown. He was no longer gasping through oxygen saturation that climbed from 68 to 84 as her hands moved on muscle memory alone. He was no longer the distinguished-looking elderly man in an isolation room. He was Admiral Morrison, 3rd Fleet Command, and his presence made the air pressure in the lobby change. Beside him stood a broad-shouldered man with a SEAL Team 3 patch on his dress uniform, his frame carrying the kind of damage that only comes from surviving things most people don't survive. His voice rumbled through the lobby like a tank idling in a garage. "She pulled my entire SEAL team out of an ambush in Helmand Province in 2019. Charlie Platoon. Sanjan Valley." He paused, and his eyes went to Katie's for a single second. "3 of us wouldn't be here without her. Marcus Rodriguez knew that. He made me promise, before he died, that if anything happened to him, I'd find her. Make sure she was okay. It took me 4 years to track down his wife." Dr. Ashford stepped backward. His jaw moved without sound. Katie saw his hand reach for the phone in his pocket, the gesture of a man used to solving problems by making calls, by leveraging connections, by weaponizing authority. But before his fingers reached the screen, the Admiral stepped directly into his line of sight. "Major Rodriguez's classified mission file just arrived from the Pentagon," Admiral Morrison said, his voice pitched so that everyone in the lobby heard it clearly. "I requested it after she saved my life for the 2nd time. Operation Desert Angel, 2019. 8 hours of sustained combat in the Jolan district, Fallujah. For Marines kept alive with field medicine and enemy fire raining down at 600 meters. The Admiral held a folder, Manila, government-issued, stamped with black ink that read Declassified BY Authority of the Pentagon. "This hospital should know who Major Rodriguez is." The hospital attorney stepped out from the corridor leading to the administrative offices. She'd been reviewing Dr. Ashford's incident report for 48 hours, cross-referencing it against patient files, against billing codes, against discharge orders. Her voice cut through the moment with the precision of someone who had already seen too much. The investigation Dr. Ashford initiated triggered a mandatory audit of all cases he supervised in the past year. We found 17 instances of falsified patient records, Medicare billing codes that exceeded documented services, fabricated performance reviews for staff who questioned his orders. She moved closer to Dr. Ashford, and her presence made him flinch. The State Medical Board has been notified. So has the Federal Inspector General's office. Dr. Ashford opened his mouth. His doctor's coat suddenly looked too heavy for his shoulders. The authority he'd built across 3 decades of rigid hierarchies, of board connections, of leveraging institutional power, all of it had been built on paperwork. And paperwork was something he'd weaponized so successfully that it had turned into a weapon now pointing directly at him. 2 security officers moved toward him, and they weren't there to protect him. They were there to escort him. His hospital credentials were about to be cut from his lanyard in front of everyone. Katie didn't move. Not because she was frozen, but because she was breathing, really breathing, for the first time since the termination letter had arrived 2 days earlier. The rain outside the lobby windows drummed against the glass like applause. Miguel closed the shadow box gently and handed it to Katie, and when she took it, her hands were steady. She looked at her son, then at the Admiral, then at the folder that contained 8 years she'd spent trying to be invisible, trying to forget, trying to start over. The Admiral stepped beside her. "We need a director of emergency medicine at Naval Hospital, Jacksonville. Someone who understands combat triage. Someone who can rebuild nursing protocols using field-tested procedures." He paused. "Someone who can make sure no one else like you gets destroyed for doing exactly what they were trained to do." The septic patient Katie had tried to save on her first shift, the one Dr. Ashford had discharged against protocol, had actually survived because another nurse had quietly rechecked his labs after the doctor left, following the example of quiet competence over loud authority. Sacred Heart's emergency team had remembered that Katie was right. They'd been waiting for this moment. Katie looked at Miguel. Her son's eyes were wet, but he wasn't trembling with fear anymore. He was trembling with something else entirely. She thought about Marcus in Helmand Province, about the dog tag that had hung under her scrubs for 6 months, about the life she'd been terrified to claim. She thought about the 11 people she'd pulled out of the smoke while everyone else was running in the opposite direction. She thought about the way her hands had moved with the kind of precision that only comes from training, from experience, from being the kind of person who runs toward fire instead of away from it. "I'll do it," Katie said quietly. Her voice had dropped an octave. It wasn't a request anymore. It was a command. But we rebuild it together. Every protocol goes through the nursing staff. No closed doors. No supply closet threats. No overhead pages. She looked directly at the Admiral. "We protect people like me. People who know what they're doing but don't have the rank to say it without getting crushed." Admiral Morrison nodded. The sound of Dr. Ashford being escorted from the lobby was almost an afterthought, the security officers moving him like he weighed nothing, like he'd already become irrelevant. By evening, his medical privileges would be suspended pending investigation. By month's end, his career would be terminated. In 6 months, he'd be sitting at a folding table outside a strip mall insurance office, selling policies to customers who didn't know they were buying insurance from a man who'd tried to destroy a major for asking questions. But that wasn't Katie's concern anymore. She had a hospital to rebuild. She had protocols to rewrite. She had nurses to protect. The dog tag that had hung hidden beneath her scrubs for so long was finally being taken out of hiding. Not to prove something to Dr. Ashford. To prove something to Sacred Heart. To prove something to herself. This is your moment to see what happens when quiet strength finally gets recognized. Subscribe to see how Katie transforms Sacred Heart's emergency department from a hierarchy built on fear into a team built on trust. Like this video if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know what you were actually capable of. And comment, would you have walked away, or would you have come back to rebuild?